Now that we have the background information that we need to be able to understand the voting methods themselves, let's actually get into the various ways that we can calculate the winner of an election using various voting methods. So there are 4 preferential voting methods that we will be discussing. The first one is the plurality method. The second one is the pairwise comparison method, plurality with elimination method, and board account method. Now, to be a preferential voting method, we will always assume that there are more than 2 voters and that all candidates will be ranked with linear ballots. When we talk about majority candidates, a lot of times people will say the candidate who receives the most votes. And it turns out that that is not, in fact, a majority candidate. A majority candidate must receive more than 50% of the first place votes. So just receiving the most votes does not make a candidate a majority candidate. It actually makes them a plurality candidate, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in order to qualify as a majority candidate, then the candidate must receive not 50% of the vote, but more than 50% of the first place votes. So how many votes would be needed for a majority if there were 30 ballots? Well, half or 50% of the vote in the case of 30 ballots would be 15. And since we're required to have more than 50% for a majority, you would need at least 16 votes for a majority. So you don't necessarily add 1, but you do round up to the next whole number. So let's think about 51 ballots. In that case, half of 51 would be 25.5. So we don't need to add 1 because that would be 26.5, which we can't have half a voter. Instead, we need to take the 25.5 and round up to 26. So for 51 ballots or 51 voters, you would need 26 votes for a majority. Note that it is not possible to have a majority candidate. Is it possible to not have a majority candidate? And the answer is yes, because if you have more than 2 candidates, so you have 3 candidates, and they divide the vote almost equally, then you can have all 3 candidates having a percentage of the votes, but none of them having more than 50% of the votes. So it is possible to not have a majority candidate. And actually, even when you have only 2 candidates, it's still possible to not have a majority candidate, because if each candidate gets exactly 50% of the vote, then you would still not have a majority candidate in that case. So as we can see, yes, many elections do not have a candidate that receives more than 50% of the votes. Can you have more than 1 majority candidate? And the answer to that question is no. Remember that a majority candidate has to have at more than 50% of the first place votes. Well, if a candidate has more than 50% of the first place votes, then even if another candidate got every other available first place vote, they would still have less than 50%. So you can see the formal justification there, but it basically comes down to it's not possible for 2 different candidates to have more than 50%, since there's only 100% of the votes available. The first method that we're going to talk about is the plurality method, and you heard me refer to plurality a little bit earlier. The plurality method simply says that the candidate with the most first place votes wins the election. So it doesn't matter if that candidate is a majority candidate. That candidate simply has to have more first place votes than any other candidate. So the candidate that has the most first place votes, we refer to as a plurality candidate. And keep in mind, this plurality candidate could be a majority candidate, but they don't have to be. If we want to give extended plurality rankings, so we want to know more than just first place, we want to know second place, third place, etc., then you determine that by the next highest number of first place votes. So whoever receives the most first place votes takes first place. Whoever receives the second most first place votes gets second place, and so forth and so on. So suppose the results for a given election are alpha 15, beta 13, gamma 12, and sigma 10. Which candidate wins under the plurality method? Well, remember the plurality method says whoever has the most first place votes wins. And in this case, alpha has the most first place votes, so alpha is the winner under the plurality method. However, what percent of the votes does the plurality candidate have in this case? Well, we know that alpha has 15 votes, and we know that to find the total number of votes, we simply add together alpha's votes plus beta's votes plus gamma's votes plus sigma votes, which in this case turns out to be 50. So alpha received 15 out of 50 first place votes, which turns out to be only 30%. So as you can imagine, the question becomes, is it fair that alpha, who only received 30% of the first place votes, won? Because that means that 70% of the voters wanted somebody other than alpha to win. And so as you can imagine, that is one of the flaws that we see with the plurality method, is that question of fairness and whether or not a candidate receiving 30% of the votes should be declared the winner. And we're going to look at fairness criterion in our last section in Unit 1, and we're going to see that all of the various methods that we have do have fairness issues. So it's really just a matter of kind of choosing the one that works best for your scenario. So what percent of the voters voted against? Well, if 30% voted for alpha, then 70% voted against, and that goes back to the argument that we just made. So which candidate wins under the plurality method? In this case, we said alpha with 15, and I think it's redoing the same. It is. It's redoing the same example. So that's just kind of a reiteration of what we just talked about. So now let's look at another example, the ABCD example. Which candidate has a plurality of the first place votes? Well, remember that means more than anybody else. So the first thing we need to do is go through and figure out how many first place votes does each candidate have. So A has 8 plus 3, or a total of 11. B has 8, C has 9, and D has 2. So in this case, A has the most, and therefore A is the plurality winner. How many first place votes would be needed for a majority? To figure out that, we need to figure out the total number of voters. And remember, to find the total number of voters, we simply add the numbers across the top. So 8 plus 3 plus 8 plus 9 plus 2 gives us a total of 30 voters. And half would be 15, but remember, for a majority we need more than half, so we're going to need a total of 16 votes for a majority in this case. So is the plurality candidate also the majority candidate? Well, we need 16 votes for a majority, and our plurality candidate got how many votes? 11. So no, the plurality candidate is not a majority candidate in this case. And a final ranking for all candidates based on the plurality method. Well, we said that A would be in first place with 11 votes. Second place is going to go to the candidate who has the second highest number of first place votes. So B had 8, C had 9, and D had 2. So C is going to come in second. B comes in third with 8, and then D will be in last place with only 2. So as you can see, the plurality method is a fairly simple method to use, which is why it is so commonly used in our elections. However, keep in mind that it does have some fairness issues because you're only taking that first place vote into consideration. Now let's look at our Wildcat example using the plurality method. Which candidate has a plurality of the first place votes? Well, C has 8, A has 6, E has 5, B has 4, and D has 5. So the winner would be would be C with 8 votes. How many would be needed for a majority? Well, 8 plus 6 is 14, 19, 23, 26, 28 total voters. Half of that would be 14, and one more would be 15. So we would need 15 votes for a majority. So is the plurality candidate also a majority candidate? And the answer is not even close. We needed 15 votes for a majority, and our plurality winner only got 8. So you can see in this example why the other 22 voters might be, the other 20 voters might be a little concerned because 20 of the 28 people voted against the winner. And that brings up again that fairness question. To provide the final ranking for all of the candidates, we're going to put them in order from least to greatest. And we have C with 8. Then we have A with 6, but remember in third place we have 2 different candidates that have 5 votes. So in this case we simply have to say that they tied because we did not have an established tiebreaker before we started the election. If you were doing this in a real life scenario, you would want to make sure that you had some type of tiebreaker defined and clearly defined before the election started, just in case you run into a scenario such as this. For example, you might use a tiebreaker of whichever candidate has the lower number of last place votes would then go in that third spot, or you might use second place votes to determine it, or you might use a different method altogether between those two that were tied. So you just have to have something that's clearly defined. So in this case, Kara gets first, Alice gets second, Eileen and Dawn tie for third, and Beth gets fifth. So we've already discussed briefly this concept of plurality versus majority, but let's look a little bit longer about this comparison. So an election can have multiple plurality candidates because if you have an election where more than one candidate ties with the most first place votes, then you can have multiple plurality candidates in that case. So an example would be alpha gets 15, beta gets 15, gamma gets 10, and delta gets 5. So alpha and beta are tied for the most number or highest number of first place votes, and therefore they are both plurality candidates. An election can have at most one majority candidate. And a majority candidate is automatically a plurality candidate because remember, a majority candidate must have 50% or more than 50% of the first place vote. So if that majority candidate has more than 50% of the first place votes, then they're automatically going to have more than anybody else. And a plurality candidate may or may not be a majority candidate because remember we saw in our previous example where there were a couple of different candidates who had the most first place votes and that made them a plurality candidate. However, they did not have enough first place votes to be a majority candidate. So let's wrap up this video by looking at some plurality method flaws. And I've jumped ahead a little bit in your student notes, so you want to jump ahead a little bit, and then we'll be going back and looking at those other examples at the beginning of our next video. But I want to wrap up with the plurality method flaws. So the first flaw that it has is that a plurality candidate might not be a majority candidate. And so that's that concept of they received less than 50% of the first place votes. Plurality method does not take a voter's preference beyond first place into account. So it doesn't care whether or not you wanted someone else in second. It only looks at your first. And the results can be manipulated by insincere voting or strategic voting. And that would be where I realize that my candidate can't win, so rather than voting for a losing candidate, I give my vote to somebody else because I want to help them win. And then the last flaw for the plurality method is that a plurality candidate may not be a Condorcet candidate. And we'll talk about Condorcet candidates a little later.